Testing one, two, three. Testing, testing.
Okay, test. Yeah, it's working.
Testing. Good evening. Welcome to our session tonight. Thank you all for coming. I know that there are a number of people still on their way in, and I've personally heard from quite a few who will be participating through the stream. It is being live streamed, and it will be on the YouTube channel for viewing in the future as well. So we're happy to be able to provide that also. Because we know that this is a very important topic, it's a very important presentation, and it will be a very important conversation for us to be having in the months and perhaps years to come. We're very excited tonight to have Glenn Sunshine and his wife Lynn here with us tonight. Glenn is a professor of history at Central Connecticut State University. He's also a senior fellow with the Colson Institute for Christian Worldview, and as well as being an award-winning author. His latest book, I know some of you have already read it, it's called Slaying Leviathan, Limited Government and Resistance in the Christian Tradition. That isn't technically our focus tonight. We're going to be looking at critical theory, but there are certainly ways in which those two topics overlap considerably. And I just found out just before we began that Glenn was attending the chapel, Geneva Chapel, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison some years ago, back when it was still a chapel, and he was there when it incorporated and became a church, and he was one of the first elders in that Christian Reformed church there in Madison. So he has a CRC connection, and he was also for a time a professor at Calvin College. So he's in the Reformed world, certainly, fully in the Reformed world, and so we speak the same language in a lot of ways in terms of those kinds of things. And as I said, we're very excited to have him here. If you're like most people, a year ago, or perhaps a year and a half ago, you probably had never heard of critical theory or critical race theory. And when you did hear about it, or hear of it, you may have just quickly dismissed it, just something that those people sometimes talk about that really doesn't touch our lives very much, and perhaps thought it was a passing kind of a thing. Or maybe you thought, this is getting a little bit too much attention. Does it really deserve that much attention? You could have thought a lot of things. But as we gather here tonight, it has sort of become or found its place or made its way into the center of debates throughout our nation and some very important and serious kinds of things and topics and issues that we all care about as Christians. The thing is, though, what is it? Where does it come from? What should we think of it as Christians, and how should we seek to engage the ongoing work of the church across racial boundaries and other boundaries as well, within the context of it being sort of the dominant framework through which society is being viewed? Those are the things that we wanted to find out more about, and those are the reasons why we invited Glenn to be here tonight. We're going to be having, hopefully, a fairly extensive time for Q&A at the end of both tonight's session and tomorrow night's session. So you'll have plenty of chances to ask questions. So along the way, take opportunity to write those things down because that's really one of the main things that we want to generate. We want information to generate discussion, and questions are a central aspect of that. Let's begin with prayer. Lord God, we thank you that you have made tonight possible, and we thank you that there are resources that we can utilize to gain a deeper understanding. And we pray that you would bless Glenn as he presents this material to us tonight. Help us to be able to understand and take hold of it. And Lord, use this here among us. And as far as it reaches, there are people who are viewing from quite a distance and will continue to view these things in the coming weeks. Help all of us to use this material in ways that further your glory and your kingdom and truth throughout this land and other lands as well. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, without further ado, Glenn, welcome. It'll take me just a second to touch your microphone now.
I'm going to wait for, there it is. Okay. First of all, just a word about the subject and about how we're going to be doing this. There are a lot of things about American culture right now that, if you think about it, they don't make a lot of sense, okay? When you look at the various kinds of alliances that you see developing politically, there's nothing obvious about why some of these different groups work together. What I'm going to be explaining tonight is that why. Because it turns out that there is a worldview which I prefer to call critical theory rather than critical race theory for reasons which we'll get into. But there's actually an entire worldview out there that shapes the thinking of people in government, people in education, people in the media, all of the areas that are levers of culture. It affects all of our communities. It's everywhere. It's being promoted in schools. I mean, we can keep going on and on. So this is actually a really important component of American culture right now, and it's really the one, frankly, that from the perspective of historic Christianity, it's our major competitor. So what we need to do is try to understand it better. And what we'll do tonight is I'm going to give you, critical theory, the whole thing comes from several different directions that all converge to create this worldview. So what I'm going to do tonight is we'll talk about what those different areas are. We have things coming out of neo-Marxism. We have things coming out of postmodernism. There's an influence of feminism. All of these various things merge together to create the worldview that we're talking about here. So tonight is mostly going to be about what is critical theory and where does it come from. Tomorrow, I'll be looking at the hidden assumptions that underlie this, that are never really articulated, but are the things that really help you make sense of why it works the way it does. And then we'll be evaluating. I'll be doing that from both a theological and a social science perspective. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So with that, let's get started. Now, here's the problem. I'm a historian. And as a historian, you never know quite how far back you want to go, because every idea you get has got antecedents. They've got people that came before it. So I had to start somewhere. So I started actually in what I would consider sort of the middle of this story with the guy that's on the right there. That's Karl Marx. And I did not actually grow the beard to make me look like him, contrary to what some people have accused me of doing. Marx got a lot of his key ideas from Hegel. I decided not to do Hegel. But what Marx said is he analyzed society in terms of economics. He said society, history, and so on moves forward on the basis of class conflict between economic classes, the people who are owners versus the workers. And this is happening through, he believed, an inevitable process by which more and more of the people on the underside of this equation will be seizing power and taking power until eventually you have a full-scale communist revolution which will take over the world. He said it's an inevitable thing because history moves in a direction. Now, these two ideas, that history is based around conflict and essentially the resolution of conflicts between groups, and the idea that history is moving in a direction, both of those are ideas he got from Hegel, German philosopher. Again, I'm not going to do much any more with Hegel. Now, the problem is, Marx was writing in the early to mid-1800s, really mid-1800s, and a century later, the proletariat hadn't exactly risen up and taken over, and everything really seemed to be entrenched in capitalism. And so this raised real problems for Marxists. So the guy on the bottom left there, that's Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci was the head of the Italian Communist Party. And Gramsci said, okay, why is it that the Marxist revolution hasn't happened? Why haven't the proletariat risen up? And he concluded that the issue wasn't really economic. I mean, it was economic, but the reason why the revolution didn't happen was cultural. It was the fact that there were people who had power in the society who essentially brainwashed the masses so that they didn't even realize that they were oppressed. They didn't even realize that they were getting the short end of the stick. And so Gramsci proposes that he calls this the hegemony. Now, I'm going to use that word a lot, more than likely. I'll try to avoid it. But this idea of the hegemony is this cultural control that the elites have over society. Now, if this is the case, what do you do about it? If you're a communist, how do you get the proletariat to wake up and realize that they're oppressed? Well, first of all, you need to realize it's not just the proletariat. There are a lot of other oppressed groups in society. So what we need to do, he said, is set up an alliance between the intellectuals who understand what's going on and the workers, and have them develop what he called a counter-hegemony, an alternative worldview that would call out the traditional hegemony, would awaken the workers to their oppression, and then allow them to rise up, and then you get your communist utopia. So that's Gramsci's idea. He's taking Marx and shifting it away from economics to these kinds of cultural issues. Then you get the group on the top left there, and this is the group we're really going to be focusing on a lot in the first part of the talk here. That is the Frankfurt School. Technically, the Institute for Social Research, originating at the University of Frankfurt. When the Nazis came to power or were heading in that direction, they relocated from Frankfurt to Geneva. Then they were invited by Columbia University to come there and settle in Columbia. And so they're going to have their biggest impact in Columbia. And the Frankfurt School was influenced by a whole lot of different people. For our purposes, the ones that are most important are Gramsci and Marx, and also, as we'll see in a moment, Sigmund Freud. And the Frankfurt School is the start of something that was known as the New Left. The New Left was a big movement in the 60s and 70s, especially the 70s in the United States. And the New Left is the one that took Gramsci's ideas and tried to figure out how they actually applied in society, in American society specifically. So anybody who is as old as I am is probably going to recognize the terminology that you see on this slide. What they said is, and some of this is straight Marxism as well, but what they said is that the masses in society have a false consciousness. What that meant is that all of these different groups in society that were oppressed, that were being held down by, well, to use terminology from the period, held down by the system or the man, all of these oppressed groups had a false consciousness because they didn't realize that they were being oppressed. They didn't realize that they were being held down. So by this point, the workers more or less drop out of the picture. What the intellectuals have to do is to raise people's consciousness, make them aware of their oppression. And so we see this going on in the 60s through the counterculture. We see it in the rise of some schools of feminism. We see it in the Black Power movement. We see it in the beginnings of, slightly later beginnings of the LGBT stuff through Stonewall, all of these kinds of things. These are efforts to raise people's consciousness, to make them aware that they are oppressed. And from this, they will develop class consciousness. They will be aware that they are part of this oppressed group. And then we will get all of these different oppressed groups together in a coalition, which will then undermine and eventually replace the hegemony and allow the Marxist revolution to move forward. So you go from false consciousness to raising consciousness to class consciousness. And this, by the way, is the root of modern identity politics. It really comes straight out of the New Left. So you'll notice what they've done at this point. They've taken Marx, who, again, talked only in terms of economic categories, and they've now broadened it, identifying all different kinds of oppressed groups in society, And by the way, that process continues. There are always new oppressed groups that are being identified. And set this system up in place where they were trying to raise consciousness, create the class consciousness, and so on. So that's the program of the New Left. It's sometimes referred to as cultural Marxism. Okay? And it's a good term. I mean, because again, it's Marxism, but instead of using economic categories, we're going to use cultural categories. Now, from there, we need to take a look at another dimension of this that's going to be really important, and that is the sexual revolution. Because it turns out the New Left is critically important for the sexual revolution in the United States and beyond. Now, to understand this, we need to go back to another 19th century figure, Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, and again, we can always push further back. We can go to Rousseau, we can go to other people as well. But what Freud does is he takes the idea that was common among the Romantics and so on, that who you really are is who you are on the inside. It's something that is personal, it's something that's internal. That is who you really are. Your identity is not what people see. Your identity is what's really inside of you. And this is what the sociologist Philip Rieff refers to as psychological man. You know, your identity is what you are on the inside. Now, that's point number one from Freud that we need to keep in mind. We'll be coming back to that. But the second part of it is that Freud had a theory of civilization. It shows up in his book Civilization and its Discontents, probably most prominently. And what he says is basically the thing that drives human behavior is sexuality. We have sexual desires that society, for good reason, tells us we can't follow, we can't fulfill. Okay? So we have all these various things that we want to engage in, these behaviors we want to engage in sexually, but society has taboos in place. And what this does is it creates a tension. It makes us feel guilty. It's really the source of mental illness, it's the source of unhappiness, all of those kinds of things, according to Freud. Now, so society's taboos create repression, as he calls it, because we're repressing our sex drive, we're not acting on it. But it turns out that that has positive effects, because the sexual energies and stuff that we have that we can't express get sublimated, get turned into other directions, and this is what provides creativity and drive in society. So it's a trade-off. People are less happy than they were, but it produces a functional and creative and effective society. So that's Freud's basic idea. Now the problem is, now remember, the New Left, the Frankfurt School, is influenced by Freud and Marx. Marx's attitude towards civilization is it's all oppression. That in fact, all civilizations are based on one group of people oppressing another. Okay? So again, it's the haves versus the have-nots. He's, again, all economic. What happens in the Frankfurt School, particularly Wilhelm Reich and Herbert Marcuse, these are the two key figures here. What they are going to do is they're going to create a Freudian Marxism in which they will say that the sexual mores of society, the taboos and all of those kinds of things, are in place so that the people in power in society can maintain their power. They create and they enforce these sexual taboos to keep the people with power in power. This is why you've got the idea of monogamous marriage. This is why you have the idea that you shouldn't engage in premarital or extramarital sex, why children should be born into intact families, all of this kind of thing. All of this, according to these guys, is a way that the people with power in society are able to maintain it. Because you see, the family is the fundamental, the base unit of civilization. But if civilization is really all about oppression, then the way that if you're going to change civilization, if you're going to end the oppression, you've got to abolish the family. This is already out there in the 60s. And so the goal for the New Left, among other things, was to eliminate what they called bourgeois, which is a nasty word in Marxism, eliminate bourgeois morality. We have to have a completely different moral system that is based on, well, in Reich's words, a sexual revolution. So Reich is the guy who coins the term sexual revolution. He's doing this already in the 30s. Marcuse is pushing it. That is going to be a key element if you think about the counterculture in the 60s. This is going to be a key element in that. It is also, as we move forward in critical theory, going to set up one of the oppressed groups, the whole LGBTQ plus community. It's being set up here already in the 60s and 70s in the context of the New Left. Okay, so let's move to the next one. How are we going to do this? So the New Left has this idea of what they want to do in society. Just because you have a concept of where you want to push society doesn't mean you have tactics. It doesn't mean you have an effective strategy for doing it. I would point to two things that the New Left argued for. The first of them is, well, they call it the long march through the institutions. That is a term that was coined by Rudi Dutschke. He's the guy over there on the left in 1967. Dutschke's idea here actually goes back to Mao Zedong. Mao took over China through something he called the Long March. And what that was literally a long march across China where he just swept the nationalist forces away and took over. And Dutschke said, that's a great model. We need a long march, but we don't need a military one. That's not going to work. What we need is a long march through the institutions. Because a society's institutions are the things that perpetuate society, that pass on values, that shape the society. Institutions are critical for society to function. So we need to take over those institutions. Now, Herbert Marcuse, who's the guy the Long March Through the Institutions is most often associated with, Herbert Marcuse, in his book Counter-Revolution and Revolt in 1972, picks up on this terminology. He's the one who popularizes the term. He popularizes the strategy. And in particular, he said that what we need to do is focus on the media. Because if we can get control of the media is the thing that shapes the way most people think. Now, Marcuse wasn't the only one. Another guy from the Frankfurt School was Max Horkheimer. And Horkheimer, this is a direct quote from him, "The revolution won't happen with guns. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move toward universal egalitarianism." Here you see, between Marcuse and Horkheimer, you see the key element of one of the key elements of the strategy. That is to take over the institutions that are the real levers of culture, that move the culture, and in particular, media, education, and politics. And I've got to give them credit. They succeeded. Because if you take a look at the direction each of these institutions has gone since the 60s, they've been moving progressively further and further to the left. So this is part of an intentional strategy. They're playing a long game here. That's the way I would describe it. They talk in terms of a long march. I'm thinking in terms of a long game. They're not interested in one election cycle or two election cycles. What they're looking at is what's happening over decades. And again, it was a very effective strategy. It has worked very well, and it is continuing to work. There's another part of the strategy as well, though, and this comes from Herbert Marcuse again. It's what he called repressive tolerance. Repressive tolerance was, as Marcuse defined it, tolerance of the left, not of the right. Tolerance of liberal ideas, tolerance of progressive ideas, tolerance of all of the things he liked, but lack of tolerance for anybody who disagreed, anyone who was traditional or conservative or anything like that. He argued in, for example, education, we needed to educate children on the principles of the left, but never tell them about the principles of the right. Never explain to them the way American society has traditionally run. We want to teach them the principles of the left. Because, he said, if you teach them the principles on the right, because they're in control of the hegemony, the right is in control of the hegemony, if you teach them those principles, it will keep them from ever actively considering the principles of the left. So you just don't teach them. In the name of intellectual freedom, you keep them from learning about conservative ideas. Indoctrination. Indoctrination is fine as long as it's being done by the left, but it's not so good from the right. Violence. Marcuse says, violence for the left, for progressive causes, should always be justified. Violence on the right should always be suppressed. Now, if you think about what's happened over the last few years, we've seen scores of lives lost in riots surrounding George Floyd's death and other related events. We've seen federal buildings, attempted arson in federal buildings. We've seen federal courthouses stormed. We've seen billions of dollars worth of damage. You have one, let's call it a riot, at the Capitol by a bunch of people, none of whom were carrying weapons. That is the national emergency. That is the national disaster. That's the biggest threat to America since the Civil War. We've got to arrest everybody who's involved, stick them in solitary confinement, and everything else. Now, I'm not justifying what happened at the Capitol, but what you're seeing in these reactions is exactly what Marcuse was advocating. We ignore the rioting from the left. As soon as there's any kind of a disturbance on the right, we come down on it like a ton of bricks. Okay. Again, intellectual freedom, according to Marcuse's essay on repressive tolerance, intellectual freedom means suppressing conservative or traditional ideas. Because if you so much as allow them expression, it won't let people seriously consider ideas from the left. Actually, originally had a rather long quote to that effect, but I cut it out because, well, they're hard to read. Anyone questioning the left, anyone questioning the agenda must be silenced. They cannot be tolerated. That's what he called repressive tolerance. And again, it's an effective strategy. We are seeing it at work today. This is exactly the kind of thing that Marcuse was talking about. Okay, so this brings us through a lot of the new left ideas and what I would call cultural Marxism. The word cultural Marxism is frequently used to describe all critical theory, and actually the term critical theory comes out of the Frankfurt School. That's what they called what they were doing. But modern critical theory, as we have it today, is not, strictly speaking, just cultural Marxism. It turns out there are other significant influences in it. One of the most important being a movement called postmodernism. Now, anybody who has studied postmodernism at all will tell you that postmodernism is virtually impossible to define. Okay, so I'm not going to try. What I will tell you, though, is that there are two figures here who are really important. The first of them is the guy on top, that's Jacques Derrida. He is a French philosopher, or was a French philosopher. And Derrida's ideas are complicated, they're difficult, and if you read followers of Derrida, they're completely opaque. There's a British philosopher named Roger Scruton who talks about these guys producing what he called a nonsense machine, because the language is, like I said, it's impenetrable. You can't really understand it. For our purposes, though, there are just a couple of ideas from Derrida that matter. The first of them is that, without getting into the details, he argued that language, the very way we define words, is really fundamentally built around society's hierarchies. The elites control language, and they control definitions. Okay? So language is really, for Derrida, an expression of the values of the elites, their way of viewing the world, that they continue to control society in many ways by the way that they control language. And so what Derrida did, he's the father of something called deconstructionism. The idea of deconstructionism is that what we need to do is examine, well, the word he used, English translation of it is texts. Now, a text can be just about anything. It isn't just what we would think of as a text, the way we use the language. But the object is to deconstruct texts, which means to look at the texts, work out what the hidden hierarchical implications are of the text, and challenge it. You need to subvert the meaning of the texts in order to mess with the powers that be, in order to mess with the people who are controlling society. Now, at this point, Derrida isn't really thinking in terms of a political program per se. He's just really talking about just sort of gumming things up, and they literally talked about what they were doing in this period as playing, okay? Just play with the stuff, challenge the hierarchies, expose them for what they are, and so on. That's really what deconstructionism is about. If any of you have had the misfortune of actually dealing with this stuff, what you probably didn't pick up is that it's a political program. Okay. So Derrida sets the stage for this, but then Michel Foucault, the guy on the bottom, another French philosopher, he's going to come along, and even though he really didn't like Derrida much at all, these two didn't get along, he's going to build on Derrida's ideas about the significance of language. And he's going to argue, first of all, that objective knowledge is impossible. We can never be objective about anything. And in fact, everything we think of as knowledge isn't really objective. It's always subjective. And knowledge is really, what counts as knowledge is really determined by the people in society that have power. Okay, so the values of the elites, which are established to maintain their elite position, determine what qualifies as knowledge. Now, this may seem kind of abstract, but you'll see the significance of this in a minute. Language, like Derrida, language is a tool that is used by the elites to maintain their power. Language is really a power game. Again, the significance of this, if you think about it for a moment, should be clear, but I will get into this in more detail in a minute. So Foucault is really a critical person here because of his concept of the interrelationship between power in society, knowledge, and language. Power determines everything. And as we move into critical theory, you're going to see that it's really all about power and about language. Now, Foucault also had a lot of things to say about sex and sexuality in general. He argued that these are social constructs. That is to say, they are things that society, our ideas of sex, our ideas of sexuality, our ideas of gender, all of these things really have no basis in reality because, of course, objective reality does not exist. So male and female are social constructs. Men and women are social constructs. And all they're there for is to maintain the power of the elites and to delegitimize LGBT people. Now, Foucault himself was homosexual, and so he saw that society's dislike, their rejection of homosexuality, he saw that as sort of a personal attack. But he then ties it to his concepts of society, power, and language. Okay. So that's the postmodern component. There's more to it than that, but that will do for now. When you take cultural Marxism and add these ideas of postmodernism into it, what you get is the next slide, excuse me. Well, first of all, language and critical theory here. Is there another one? Yeah, this is where I meant to be. All right. This is what I would call second-generation critical theory. The first generation of critical theory is the stuff coming out of the Frankfurt School. Like I said, it's their term. Second-generation critical theory is cultural Marxism plus postmodernism. So you have Gramsci's idea of the hegemony, this idea of the social control of the elites that are keeping the oppressed people oppressed. And with this, the call for the counter-hegemony, the counter-ideas or a counter-ideology that will undermine the power of the elites. You have the New Left then takes this and refines it to add a whole series of oppressed classes. It's no longer just the proletariat. It's all kinds of oppressed groups that are now part of this, that we're working toward raising consciousness and developing class consciousness, group identity, identity politics, all of those kinds of things. But then you add to that Derrida's challenge of the idea of hierarchies in society, particularly through language, and working to undermine that through deconstruction, and Foucault's concept of the power dynamics of language. Foucault, this idea that the elites control knowledge and control language, and they use both of those things to keep themselves in power. And again, this may seem abstract, but a lot of this stuff fits in very directly with what we're seeing right now in, say, the Black Lives Matter movement or several others. Now, we need to look at language a little bit more, because language is, this is now our third tool. We have the Long March Through the Institutions as a strategy. We have repressive tolerance as a strategy. Now language is the third arrow in their quiver, because a lot of what they're doing in critical theory really involves an emphasis on language. Now, we have to start here with the connection between language and thought. In linguistics, I was a linguistics major as an undergrad. In linguistics, there's this idea called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And what this says is that language shapes thought more than the other way around. It's not so much the way we think that shapes language, it's language that shapes the way we think. And this exists in a hard and soft version. The soft version says language influences thought. The hard version says language determines thought. But one way or another, language is going to shape how you think. What you can express in your language is going to determine what it is possible for you to think. If there's a concept that you don't have words for, you can't really even think it. You can't really understand it. Okay? So that's the basic principle behind the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Now, when you add Foucault here, what you get is language is a tool of the elites. It's a tool of the hegemony. And so language is being used to shape the thought of the people. And it's controlled by the elites, and therefore, elite use of language shapes the culture. If language is a tool of the hegemony, then it also must be a tool of the counter-hegemony. We've got to take over and redefine language so that certain ideas become unthinkable and other ideas become unquestionable. And because of this, we have political correctness. Political correctness is a direct expression of this. Now, I'll give you a simple example of how this works. When I was growing up, back in the 60s, there were a lot of words that were used for people of African descent in America, some of which were considered nasty, but others of which were perfectly acceptable. So, for example, talking about someone as a colored person was not considered in any way inappropriate or pejorative. And if you have any questions on that, I would urge you to look at what NAACP actually stands for. It's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It was not considered an insulting term. Negro. Never use that today, but we can find things like the United Negro College Fund. Not considered a pejorative word. However, what ends up happening is both of these words are considered somehow to be prejudicial. They're considered words that make you look on people of African descent as being less than whites. So what we need to do is to change the language to find a term that is sufficiently neutral so that people won't have bigoted or prejudicial thinking. So instead of Negro or colored person, we're going to refer to them as black. Except, over time, they sort of realized that they're not all black. They're black, brown, and beige, to quote Duke Ellington. So black went out of fashion. So then it became Afro-American. But that went out of fashion and became African-American. And then black came back in as well. So now we have African-American and black. And then we add the phrase people of color to expand it even further. People of color is different from colored people. I don't know why, but it is. What are they doing? The reason for this progression in language is because they're trying to find a way of describing that group of people in a way that will not carry with it bigoted implications. And if we can make the bigoted language taboo and only allow the unbigoted language, then we can eliminate racism. That's the idea. It's actually an effort at thought control. Okay. We can also look at this from the perspective of Freud, or actually Rief's idea of psychological man. Who we are, our identity is who we are on the inside. That means that if I question your view of yourself, if I challenge you in terms of your own self-conception or your own self-identity, then what I am doing is fundamentally attacking you as a person. And this becomes hate speech. Or you become fill-in-the-blank phobic, homophobic, transphobic, Islamophobic. What's a phobia? It is an irrational fear of something. So you call people phobic in fill-in-your-blank category as a way of delegitimizing criticism of whatever it is you're talking about. Because the only reason why you would do this is you have an irrational fear of the person or of the identity. It's this idea of the irrational fear. Whenever you see phobic, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to tell you that challenging or questioning the identity here is an expression of irrational fear. They're taking control of the language to define the other people, the people who disagree with them. You also get the idea that language is violence. If I use words that are offensive to you, that challenge your self-identity, your self-conception of who you are, that is a fundamental attack on who you are, because who you really are is who you are on the inside. And challenging that or attacking that is just as violent as if I punched you in the mouth. Which is why Antifa, in the name of protection, in the name of self-defense, has no problem with sucker punching people who challenge what they're thinking. Because by simply challenging them, language is violence, and therefore in self-defense, I can strike you. I can hit you with a bicycle lock. And then you go to the next step. Silence is violence. If you do not positively affirm the cause that is being supported, you are de facto committing violence against the people who are part of that cause. So silence is violence as well, and violence in self-defense can be met by physical violence. All of this, you will notice, is surrounding language and controlling language, control of language, to promote a particular way of thinking, to create a situation where there are certain ideas or words that are inexpressible. You do not dare say them as a way of stamping out those ideas and eliminating them from society. It's a very self-conscious part of the program. Delegitimizing them through language like phobias, referring to disagreement as hate speech, as violence, and so on. So language is a critical part of the game here. But we're not done. Now we get to critical race theory. Now we have to be really careful here, because everybody talks about critical race theory, but there's a technical definition for what critical race theory is, and then there's sort of the popular use of it. I'm going to give you the technical definition first. It starts with this guy. That's Derek Bell. Derek Bell was a law professor at Harvard, and his core idea for our purposes is that US law is structurally white supremacist. That US law is based almost entirely on promoting the white race and suppressing the black race. That's his core idea. Now, the obvious thing that you can ask is, well, what do you do with the civil rights movement in the 60s? The blacks have made huge strides over the years. We're no longer, we fought a war to abolish slavery. We no longer have Jim Crow. We've got the Voting Rights Act, all these kinds of things. How do you answer that, Professor Bell? He says, advances in civil rights for blacks only happen when they are actually about benefiting whites. Now, that may sound counterintuitive, but consider. We have letters that have become available, I guess, through Freedom of Information Act, cables and such from the State Department, where during the race riots in the 60s, the State Department was sending cables to Washington basically saying the situation that blacks are facing in America is creating all kinds of foreign policy problems for us. We're being attacked on these cases. We're being challenged on these. This is really making America look bad. And so to defend white America, they passed the Civil Rights Act and things like that to quiet overseas criticism. That's the way Derek Bell interprets those cables. Okay? So it's all about maintaining the power of the whites. Now, this is where we get the idea of systemic racism. Now, we have to be really careful here because the phrase systemic racism can mean two different things. It has both a hard definition and a soft definition. The soft definition says that systemic racism is racism that exists within systems and institutions in the United States. So police departments, as an institution, there's racism in that. There's racism in these various institutions. That's the soft definition of systemic racism. For the soft definition, I would prefer the term institutional racism. The hard definition of systemic racism says that racism is so deeply embedded in American society that it's not a bug, it's a feature. And what that means is that it's part of the core operating system of the country. If you accept the hard definition of systemic racism, then it is impossible to eliminate racism in the country without eliminating the country altogether, without eliminating American culture, American society, and so on. It is irredeemable because it is part of the DNA of the system. You cannot reform it out because it is fundamental to what the country is about. Okay. Now, the critical race theory is an academic field. It is part of critical legal studies and so on. That's the technical definition of it right there, what I just gave you. It's used much more broadly within society. But let's push this a little bit further, though. Let's take a look at what some of the core ideas within critical race theory in its technical sense, what it's about. And I'm going to tie this in with cultural Marxism because it turns out that Derek Bell, consciously or unconsciously, is heavily influenced by the rhetoric of the New Left. He sees race, first of all, as a social construct. What that means is that race does not have any objective reality. It is just simply something that society creates for its own convenience. In point of fact, I think he's right about this. Consider, for example, that no matter what you pick as a marker of race, it exists in a continuum. There are places in Northern Europe where people have skin almost as white as snow, and there are people in Africa, places in Africa and India and elsewhere where you have people with skin nearly as black as coal, and you have every gradation and shade in between. Where do you draw the line? Same with eye color, same with hair color, texture. Where do you draw the line? It's arbitrary. Further, the word race has meant different things over the centuries. I've read documents from the 17th, 18th century in which race is used essentially interchangeably with nationality. So I've seen discussions where the British race is distinguished from the French race, the German race, or the Italian race. The word changes in definition over time, to modern, what's technically referred to as scientific racism, emerges largely in the 19th century. And it emerges partly as a response to the increasing attacks on the slave trade, and partly to justify European conquests and domination of cultures around the world. And thus, race gets reduced to, well, originally 3 races. You've got your Caucasoids, whites, you have your Negroids, blacks, and you have your Mongoloids, Asians. Okay? And by the way, what I just gave you is, in the Christianized version of this, Japheth, Ham, and Shem. 3 sons of Noah. They provide your 3 races. Scientifically, they don't typically go there, but it's worth noting that there is that connection that's made by some people. Why do they do this? Well, in the words of Charles Darwin, he argued that eventually, he wasn't a fan of this, but he said, look, eventually the civilized races, by which he meant the Europeans, would, his word, exterminate the savage races, meaning everybody else, because survival of the fittest demanded that. And since the Europeans were the most advanced, the most fit, they had the right to dominate the surrounding world. And to put it in slightly different terms, maybe you might want to think better of yourself than that, so you're going to say, well, I'm going to bring the benefits of white civilization to these poor, benighted people out there. It's literally what happened. That's where our modern idea of race comes from. I've already done race in biology. I started with that one. But from here, we need to start looking at the word racism. Racism has changed in meaning. There are at least 3 different meanings that I've been able to identify. When I was a kid, racism meant you thought people of other races were inferior to you. You looked down on people from other races. And frequently this would be expressed in language or even in action. Somewhere probably in the 80s, certainly by the 80s, the definition of racism changed. Racism was now thinking poorly of another race plus power. So if you did not have access to power, you couldn't be a racist, which meant that only whites could be racists, because whites were the only ones, of course, who have access to power. Now, I've got to provide a little bit of a critique of this right away because, frankly, it's nonsense. Let me give you an example. They use exactly the same line of reasoning with regard to men and women within feminism. All of these different ideas parallel each other. When I was in grad school, when I was a teaching assistant, I had to take a seminar on sexual harassment. And now, I was a teaching assistant, so in the classroom where I taught, just before my class met, there was a feminist gender studies class, women's studies class, taught by an endowed chair. Professor was an endowed chair. Now, if you're not in academia, you won't know what that means. That's the top of the pecking order. That's as high as you can get in academia, as an endowed chair. And she didn't allow any men in her class, by the way. But one day I walked in and there were handouts in there, and I'm a chronic reader. I picked it up and I looked at it, and it was on pornography. And among other things, it included the statement, pornography is a textbook teaching men how to treat women. And I thought, yeah, right, and just basically ignored it. But then I got to my sexual harassment training workshop. And there I was told that as a male, I had access to institutional power, therefore I could be guilty of sexism, whereas women couldn't be. So during a break, I went up to the guy who was teaching the class, and I said to him, all right, I'm not putting in a complaint or anything, I'm just trying to understand this. And I told him about this brochure, Pornography is a Textbook Teaching Men How to Treat Women. And I said, now, if I were to make a statement along the lines of Harlequin romances are a textbook teaching women how to have relationships with men. Now, if I were to say something that's stupid, I could be brought up on sexual harassment charges, right? He said, oh, absolutely. I said, so what's the difference between that and the other? With a straight face, the guy told me, well, you have access to institutional power. I was a graduate student. She was an endowed chair. Who had the power there? I'll give you a hint. She did. She could have crushed me like a bug if she wanted to. So who really has access to institutional power? Is it really determined by skin color? I don't think so. I mean, that may be a factor, but it isn't the only one, and frankly, there are others that are much more important than it, much like my relationship with this professor who shall go nameless. But we're not even at the newest definition of racism. The newest definition of racism is if you're white, you're a racist. That's literally what is being said. Because as a white person, whether or not you are consciously, you can have racism without racists in this modern way of looking at it. As a white person, you benefit from the systemic racism that exists in society, therefore you are complicit with it, therefore you're a racist. Whether you have a racist thought, action, word, or anything else doesn't matter. The fact that you've benefited from systemic racism makes you a racist. Okay. That's the newest definition that we're working with coming out of critical race theory. And this brings us to the idea of the cultural hegemony. I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but this is the cultural hegemony in critical race theory is really built around the ideas of white supremacy and white privilege. White supremacy means that the systems are designed to keep whites in power. White privilege means that everything that happens in society is designed to benefit whites, not people of color. Okay. So those are core elements behind critical race theory. But there's another dimension that gets added to this by a woman by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw. Hello, Kimberly. I'm having problems advancing the slide. Oh, a couple of them there. Yeah, that's Kimberly. She was an associate of Derek Bell. She's an important, with Derek Bell, she's considered one of the two key founders of critical race theory. And her big thing was, her major contribution is the idea of intersectionality. This is the idea that the degree, initially at least, it starts with the idea that the degree of oppression you feel comes from the number of oppressed categories you belong to. So we'll start with what I would describe as the approved categories of oppression: race, sex, or gender, then lesbian, gay, bisexual, and ultimately transgender. There are a few others as well, but these are the main ones. And the question then is, how do the various categories of oppression interact? Each of these groups are oppressed. So how does this interact? If you're a black man, you feel one kind of oppression. If you're a woman, you feel another kind of oppression. If you're a black woman, you feel oppression as both a black and a woman, and as a black woman. And if you're a lesbian, we add that into it as well, and so on. So it's all, the buzz phrase for intersectionality is all oppression is the same. Oppression is oppression is oppression. You're going to feel it in different ways and to different degrees depending on which oppressed categories you are. You will notice that poverty is not on the list. Because frankly, they don't care about poor coal miners in Appalachia. They're not among the oppressed categories. It's really poverty is thrown in as a secondary issue, but a secondary issue usually connected to race. Not really interested in that. You'll notice how far we drifted from classical Marxism. Now, intersectionality is also critical now for identity. Okay. It's usually used mostly in connection with oppression, but it goes beyond that. Critical race theory, in both its popular, well, especially in its popular form, rejects the idea that there's any kind of universal about humanity. As Christians, we would say all people are created in the image of God, and that's what gives them their value. The critical race theory says, no, there are no universals. Remember, there's no objective truth. If there's no objective truth, you can't really talk about a universal affecting all of humanity. But you're not even an individual either. They also reject the idea of the individual. What you are is really the product of the approved intersectional categories. So everything that you think, everything you say, everything that you do is not something that you've come up with. It's just simply a product of which intersectional categories you belong in, and that particular, well, intersection of all these various things coming together determines who you are and everything about you. You're not really, it's weird because philosophically, you either tend to emphasize the particular, the individual, or the universal. Critical race theory rejects both. Now, where this goes, excuse me, one more step. This comes from actually Feminism from Sandra Harding, that's her. This is what's known as standpoint theory. Standpoint theory says that what you consider knowledge comes basically out of your intersectional categories. So it starts off with, in feminism, that women think differently than men and they have different concepts of knowledge than men do. Okay? The way this develops further is we now extend this to all intersectional categories. Knowledge comes from which groups you belong to. There's no such thing as objectivity. Lived experience, this phrase lived experience, you'll see a lot of it if you read this stuff. Lived experience is a source of truth. The experiences that you have are self-validating and self-interpreting. So when something happens to you, you're going to look at it, you're going to evaluate it, you're going to say this is what it means, and then that is truth. Okay? That is the truth. Now what this means is that people who have experienced, well, or have been perceived, people who perceive themselves to having been victims of racism are in fact victims of racism, period. And you cannot question that because the people who are oppressed are the only people who can really identify what oppression is. Voddie Baucham, a Southern Baptist pastor and theologian, refers to this as ethnic Gnosticism, that these groups that have experienced oppression have this sort of secret knowledge where they can identify it even if other people can't. The lived experience, self-interpreted, is truth. Now, to take this a step further, since whites control the culture, whites never have to worry about other kinds of experiences. They only know their own culture. People of color, minorities, have to know white culture because they have to function in it, but at the same time, they also have their own lived experience. They know their own culture and things like that. Therefore, minorities have a superior understanding of the world than whites. Now, this may seem a little bit odd, but I would like you to consider the words of Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who in her confirmation hearing said, "I would hope that a wise Latina woman with the richness of her experience would more often than not reach a better conclusion than a white male who hasn't lived that." This is an expression of standpoint theory. This is exactly what it looks like. Because, of course, there's no objectivity, but you have a broader range of experiences as a minority. Now, the implications of this are, first of all, particularly with standpoint theory here. Again, objectivity does not exist. It is impossible to be objective. Everything that we know, or everything we think we know, is culturally determined. That's Foucault. White culture, in particular, includes things like science, it includes logic, it includes insistence on evidence, it includes things like statistics, this kind of analysis. These are the values of white culture, but they are no more objectively real than the experience, the lived experience of people, of minorities, of people of color, and so on. And in practice, then, the experience of people of color trumps all of these things that whites might marshal against them. So if you talk about statistics of police shootings of blacks, I think it was last year, it happened 9 times total. If you use that kind of statistic to say the police are not at war against blacks, you can dismiss that because that is white truth, white knowledge. It is not the lived experience of people of color that is more valuable than that in terms of understanding the world. And it applies not just to things like science or statistics or whatever, it applies to all knowledge coming out of the cultural hegemony. The minority knowledge is more sure, more true in a very real sense because they have to know and understand white culture, they understand that, but they've also got their own lived experience, which they then interpret and can make better sense of it. What this means functionally is that with standpoint theory, there is no possibility of shared truth. Now, when we look at critical theory and critical race theory, critical race theory, like I said, is technically this narrow academic discipline. But it turns out that the way the language is used when we talk about critical race theory, what we're really talking about is a broader umbrella of critical theory. Why would I say that? Well, again, it's been scrubbed from the website, but if you look at a group like Black Lives Matter, which sounds like it's about racism, if you looked at their website originally, and I did this, when it first came out, I went to their website and I said, all right, what is this group about? And they said, among other things, that they were about dismantling the patriarchal nuclear family. Where have we heard that before? It's Herbert Marcuse in The New Left. It was about children being raised by the community to the degree that mothers, parents, note the word parents there, mothers, parents, and children were comfortable with it. You'll notice the complete omission of the word father, because if you talk about father, men are an oppressor category. In a world in which 2 women can marry, they're both parents. One might be the biological mother, but the other is the parent. And in fact, to make that absolutely clear, they had a very strong statement in support of LGBTQ plus people, and in particular, transgenders. That's Black Lives Matter. That's popular term, critical race theory. But a lot of it has nothing to do with race, which is why I prefer critical theory as an umbrella term. Now, we'll get into this more tomorrow. I'm actually over time already here. But we'll get into this more tomorrow. But when we look at critical theory as an umbrella, it includes, well, certainly racial issues. It includes feminism. It includes some branches of feminism, not all of them. It includes LGBTQ plus issues. It includes, oddly enough, believe it or not, fat studies, where people are making arguments that obesity is a social construct, and that, in fact, the medical doctors who say it's unhealthy are speaking out of the hegemony, and all their facts and science really don't matter because the lived experience of people who are obese trumps that. This is literally true. I'm not making this up, okay? It also includes things like radical environmentalism, because the earth becomes an oppressed category. It's oppressed by industrialization. Radical greens, not all greens, but some of the radical greens fall under this umbrella. We can look at it in support of Muslims. So Islamophobia is part of the white hegemony. We need to support the Muslim community because they are victims of Christian and Western oppression. You ever wonder how it is that a movement that embraces LGBTQ plus things also embraces Islam? When in Muslim countries they execute gays. Why is that? They're both oppressed categories. And therefore, the umbrella of critical theory can embrace both of them. Or similarly, feminism in Islam, where women aren't allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, or you have to wear a hijab or whatever. So this is what's going on. Critical race theory is the term that is commonly used. I think critical theory is a better term because it points out the broader range of issues that the people who are in support of this movement do. Now, we've gone through a lot of material. We've done it really quickly here. But again, just to quickly summarize it, the elements that come together here to create critical theory are, first of all, cultural Marxism, the neo-Marxism coming out of Gramsci and the Frankfurt School, and all of the things that are associated with that, identifying all these various oppressed categories, the idea of coming up with a way of undermining that, and a set of tactics as well. We've got ideas emerging from postmodernism, especially surrounding language, knowledge, and power from Foucault. We have the sexual revolution, which is coming out of neo-Marxism as well. That's an important element of it, particularly with this, the idea that you are who you are on the inside, coming out of Freud and other people, so that your self-identity becomes who you are, and any questioning of that becomes an attack on you as a person. And then we have very strongly recently the critical race theory coming in as well, the technical critical race theory coming in as well, to help shape the movement currently in a direction that puts a lot of focus on race, because that is a clear and obvious case where there are genuine problems. And so we can use that as a rallying cry, but a rallying cry that brings in all of these other categories of oppression and identity politics into a single unit. Okay, so that's what it is, and this is where it comes from. Tomorrow, I'm going to be looking at some of the hidden assumptions that they make about the way the world works, and I'll be evaluating it, talking. There are some things that we have to acknowledge they get right, okay? But so we'll look at that. We'll also look at what I would see as the weaknesses of it, both from a biblical perspective and from the perspective of things like sociology, anthropology, and so on. So with that, I'm done. Any questions? Now, I'll be honest with you, I refuse to believe that that was so clear that nobody has a question. But so let's just take that as given, yeah.
Let's make sure, just for...
When the people who are espousing this, they run up against someone who's clearly part of one or more oppressed groups and simply doesn't share this view at all. They believe in what might otherwise be termed white patriarchal values and all that sort of thing. Do they say those people are oppressed and simply fail to realize it?
They've got false consciousness.
Or do they write them off as an anomaly who was sheltered and therefore their opinion doesn't matter? I mean, how can they not validate that person's definition of who they are?
Well, they would say they've got a false consciousness. It's going straight back to Marx and the New Left ideas. They've got a false consciousness. They haven't really realized just how oppressed they really are. It's also worth noting that the CRT people make an interesting distinction between a black person and a person who happens to be black. A black person is one who shares the ideology. A person who happens to be black, their view, they don't really count as a representative of black people. They're simply a person who happens to be black, who's got a false consciousness, who bought into the lies of the hegemony. And therefore, their view doesn't really count. That's a really good question, but yeah. And we'll be touching on aspects of that again tomorrow.
I've always thought that one of the miscalculations of Marx, as he wrote in the 1800s, and he looked at this dialectic moving forward, the disparity of the working class and the owner of production, et cetera, was this was never really realized in the United States because of the rise of the middle class. And we see applications of that today. How dangerous is it to this way of thinking is the possibility that people who have been considered marginalized or oppressed can take hold of more and more of the American dream, actually join the middle class, and share in the kind of prosperity that we all like to see. But how dangerous is it to that way of thinking that you would have some minorities or considered oppressed classes taking part in what's called the American dream?
Yeah, the one thing Marx never anticipated is that the system could reform itself. And it's not just in America, but in Britain and all these other countries, conditions for the workers were improved. Now, the answer is most likely going to be something along the lines of, well, it only improved because the factory workers had to do that, or they'd have faced, they were just trying to hold off the revolt, so they had to do this, but it was really in their benefit to do it. That's probably what they would argue. I would actually say that the danger goes in the other direction, because ideologies are impervious to argument. And what we're dealing with here are ideologues. The real danger is, what do you do if you are the owner of a black business when it's decided that we're going to riot in Minneapolis? The danger goes the other way around. And it's worth noting that if you take a look at Antifa, for example, they're almost all white, almost universally. They tend to be upper class. They tend to be educated. These are not the have-nots rising up. No revolution is ever started from the bottom. Revolutions historically are always started by elites. And what we're seeing in the agitation, particularly the violence that surrounds this, are mostly people from the elites. And the people who are in real danger are the people who own those businesses. It's not so much the fact that they own businesses, the fact that they're successful, the fact that we had a president who was black is irrelevant. Because that's logic, and that's an argument that you're making using evidence, and that's you playing on your own field, and it says nothing about my lived experience. I know better because I live it. Now, the irony is, like I said, a lot of the people who are doing this are in fact whites from privileged backgrounds. That's the backbone of Antifa. But nonetheless, that's the way the argument emerges.
Yes, I was just wondering, is this critical race theory that you've described, is that being taught in, I know it's being taught in schools, but obviously what you've showed us is very complicated. It would be pretty hard for kids, let alone adults, to follow. So what's the critical race theory that's being pushed in the public schools?
Forget all the history, just get to the conclusion. The country is irredeemably racist. It's racist from its founding all the way back in 1619, not 1776. Whites are oppressors. People of color are virtuous because they are not oppressors. Oppression is really the only sin in this system. So people of color are always innocent and they are always victims. Whites are always the oppressors. That's essentially what's being taught. Okay. I had a friend who asked his daughter in high school, what's the most important thing she learned about George Washington? She said he was a slave owner.
Yeah, where is critical race theory being taught in schools? As a background, I've made it through public school, large public school. I go to a large public university, and I've never been taught that, the system is irredeemably racist, or really. So my question is, are more schools teaching more history of other races, like the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, stuff like that I had to learn in a TV show? Mm-hmm. Is it that, or are they teaching that the system is truly irredeemable and must be ripped out?
What you're seeing now, that's a really good question. And the interesting thing about this is we are in a period where there is a radical change taking place in education right now. Basically, ever since George Floyd, what we're seeing is an increasing emphasis on critical race theory going all the way down, critical theory more broadly, going all the way down to kindergarten. And that's literally true. I mean, you will notice that, one of Freud's assumptions is that human beings are intrinsically sexual, which means children are intrinsically sexual. So that means we have to have sex education age appropriate in kindergarten. I'm sorry, there is no age appropriate kindergarten sex education. But if you believe the ideology, there is. This is being pushed systematically in a lot of schools. I have read accounts where whites in schools were ordered to stand up and apologize to black students for their racism. These are elementary school kids. This is happening. It's not exactly universal, but it's happening and it's a growing movement. As far as the universities go, I don't know how much it's being taught explicitly in the particular courses you've got, but what I can tell you is in the history department where I just retired, there were basically 3 of us who didn't agree with this. The rest of the department all more or less accepted these ideas. And I'm not at a tier 1 university. You know, I wasn't at a school that offered doctorates or things like that. It's been in those schools for a lot longer. I was in a school that offered master's degrees and nothing more than that. It's gotten down to our level. The administration pushes it. I mean, pretty much everywhere I look and everybody I talk to in academia, it's there. A lot may depend on individual professors or the courses that you're taking, but trust me, I don't care where you're going to school, there are places in your school that are promoting it. I guarantee it.
One other question. Did you equate January 6th to the race riots in Minneapolis as equally bad, or were those examples? I want to make sure I don't misjudge anything.
I used it as an example of the fact that you had a couple of hundred people who went into the Capitol. Exactly under what circumstances are unclear. There was certainly a certain amount of violence and things like that. They were certainly trying to influence Congress, but they were completely unarmed. The only person who got shot was shot by someone who was a Capitol Police officer. There were initial reports, and she was unarmed. When does a policeman shoot an unarmed person and there isn't even an inquiry? You have a report that one of the Capitol policemen was hit with a fire extinguisher by one of the rioters and subsequently died. That made it all over the news. And then it was reported that, in fact, that was incorrect. That didn't happen. He died of natural causes, was not assaulted. That has not been reported. Is this really the most serious threat to the country since the Civil War? If it is, this is the only unarmed insurrection in history.
I mean, I just looked it up. The fact that they had weapons, several of them were charged by the FBI with having firearms, and there were 14 Molotov cocktails found. I mean, those are weapons.
Okay, the firearms violation, now, not a shot was fired, but maybe that would be a better way of saying it.
Yes, that is true.
But consider billions of dollars worth of damage, scores of people dead, entire neighborhoods burnt out, the livelihoods of all kinds of people destroyed, federal government buildings attacked and attempted arson there, an independent territory, a self-identified independent territory formed in the middle of an American city. And yet none of that so much as raises an eyebrow.
I mean,
where are the congressional inquiries into that?
I mean, okay, so I don't want to go back and forth debating. I mean, okay, there were, of the people protesting or rioting, because there was both, plenty of people were charged. It wasn't like everyone went off free.
Sure.
The other thing, yeah.
Although many of them were arrested and then released. That is also true.
Okay. The other thing, yes, there is a huge issue in the media, right, with how reporting and stuff like that.
And that was the point.
You have a great point.
That was really the key point. It's this idea of repressive tolerance. We downplay anything violent on the left or justify it, but we come down with a ton of bricks of anything coming on the right. That was really, the disparity was really the point that I was making as an illustration of the way repressive tolerance works.
Okay, last thing, and then I'll pass the mic. I've talked for a little bit, but
sure.
I don't see how calling January 6th not clear, what the motive, not clear. I think it was very clear personally, and like not a big deal. I can't remember your exact words. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I want to be fair to you. However, that was the first time a Confederate flag ever entered the Capitol building, ever. That includes the Civil War. I mean, that's big.
I'm not sure that's as big as you think it is, but okay.
I think it is, actually. The people that tried to break off and save slavery in the nation, that flag was brought into the Capitol, not in the Civil War, but 150 years later.
Okay.
I'm going to pass the mic.
Yeah, we can disagree on how significant that really is, because I don't think the Confederate flag is really being used today as a way of supporting slavery. I really don't think it is. I think it serves other purposes. Personally, I think the Confederate flag is kind of dumb and we should get rid of it. I'm not a fan of it. But I don't really think it's really about slavery anymore. I think it's got other significance for the people who use it. But that's, your mileage may vary.
Just thinking about the ideology, just kind of test my thinking here. If it's achieved in terms of the oppressed groups and they are able to achieve the power, I'll call it, that's, the struggle over power, don't they become the oppressor? Isn't that a logical outcome of
Yeah.
a pursuit
And
from this?
you're absolutely right there. We'll deal with this. That's something I'm going to talk about tomorrow. The eschatology of the movement is
Okay.
a guarantee of perpetual conflict between the races. And if the other group, Rod Dreher has a thing he calls the law of merited impossibility. And the law of merited impossibility says that can never happen, and when it does, you deserve it.
Okay.
If there is an eschatology, it's summarized by the law of merited impossibility. It will never happen that these groups will actually take over. The conflict is going to be there forever. It'll never happen, but when they do, you'll deserve what you get.
I have a question about when sort of two of these groups that can claim certain parts of intersectionality clash. A really big example would be a Muslim minority group, Uyghurs, in a massive country, but in the CRT intersectionality language are minorities, Chinese. Obviously, CRT voices aren't saying a whole lot about that because it's really hard to find actual reporting on it.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
The CRT advocates are singularly uninterested in what happens in other countries. I mean, that would be my observation here. There's tons of evidence on what's happening with the Uyghurs. There's tons of evidence what's happening with Tibetans. There's tons of evidence what's happening in Hong Kong. We can go to North Korea. We can go to the fact that Christians are the most persecuted religion in the world, that thousands upon thousands are being martyred each year, and they don't care. They're concerned about what's happening in America. Now, having said that, there are examples of this within America among the various oppressed groups. The best example of this are a particular segment of feminists who strongly object to transsexuals, to trans women. They said they're not real women. These are, the pejorative term for these are TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, TERF. And what you see happening is there is a kind of systematic attempt to cancel them. They're being excluded, they're being basically rejected, thrown out of positions of influence within the movement, because you can't have that. So there are tensions that exist. And what I will tell you, again, this is some of the stuff we'll deal with tomorrow, the LGBTQ plus movement, there is nothing that these groups really have in common. Lesbians and gays never really worked together until Stonewall. Transsexuals don't really fit. Because if, in fact, you accept the idea of transsexuals, you've got to reject the idea of lesbians or gays. They just don't go together. The only thing that they have in common is they're bent on undermining traditional sexual mores. And if we ever get rid of heteronormativity, they're going to have a civil war. Because the only thing that unites them is opposition to traditional sexual morality. So there are tensions. I don't think these coalitions can hold. especially if they start really succeeding in what they're going about doing.
It seems to me that diversity, inclusion, and equity comes out of this.
Yep.
And that is making its way not just in public schools and public universities, but also into Christian colleges and Christian universities. Could you describe a little bit of that transition over to diversion, inclusion, and equity?
Okay, let's first of all recognize the terminology here, because once again, we're doing a language game. Diversity is based around the premise of intersectionality. If you are, just to keep it simple, if you are black, you think one way. If you are white, you think a different way. So diversity means getting the correct check boxes so that you have representatives of all these different groups, because if intersectionality is correct, a representative of the group is going to think like the group. Okay, so diversity is more a matter of filling the org chart, as it will, getting the correct categories in, than actually looking at intellectual diversity or diversity of opinion. The assumption is, now it's a hidden assumption, but the assumption is that if you get representatives of all the different groups, you will have a diversity of opinion. The problem is you don't. Okay. Inclusion, again, it's based on these various intersectional groups. Equity is the really interesting one because they've completely redefined the word. What equity originally meant was something along the lines of, well, for example, in economics, in traditional social justice, the idea of equity, the equity theory said that you would get rewards in proportion to your contribution. Equity now means everybody gets equal results at the end of the day. So they've redefined the words to sort of shift the discussion into their home turf. Okay? But because of a couple of things, this is now, first of all, it's becoming de rigueur. You've got to do this in the business world. You've got to have a diversity, inclusion, and equity department or representation in human resources or something like that. You've got to have it there because if you don't, there is going to be consequences in terms of public relations. Universities operate the same way, including Christian colleges. One of the things that I find myself most distressed about in this whole thing is the response of the churches and with this other Christian organizations, because number one, we have to recognize that there are genuine problems out there. But we also have to recognize that critical theory is not the solution. That within the Christian tradition, within the historic Christian tradition, we have ample resources to deal with issues of bigotry, to deal with issues of racism, all of these kinds of things. We have the resources to deal with them. We've just completely forgotten our own past. We've completely forgotten our own history. And frankly, we haven't thought these things through theologically.
Thank you. Can I follow up with the idea that when I ask, are these ideas coming out of critical theory?
Yep.
Why is that so very quickly rejected? No, that's not where this is coming from. And yet I can see that, as you describe it, this fits perfectly, that these do come from there. Why is it we must reject this association with critical theory?
Because critical theory is itself a controversial term. And if you are dealing, particularly in America, there is a very sharp political divide where critical theory has turned into a lightning rod for certain groups. So if you don't want those groups to object to what you're doing, you'll say, oh no, this isn't really critical theory.
One of the things that helped me in an interview that I watched with Chris Rufo is conservative media likes to talk a lot about the hypocrisy that's evident in, for instance, the George Floyd riots versus, what happened January 6th, to use a recent example. And Chris said, you've got to stop talking about hypocrisy. This is the point. The point is repressive tolerance. That is the point.
Right.
And
it's not really hypocrisy. It's part of the program.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's been very helpful to me. to be able to dismiss the hypocrisy aspect
Yeah.
and to understand what it actually is.
Yeah. Now, the real danger on the, that's part of the danger on the conservative side. We don't get the fact that this is sort of programmatic. But the other danger is that we can reject the entire idea that, you know, there are problems with racism in some of our institutions. We reject critical race theory, we reject critical theory, therefore we reject any idea associated with it. That's dangerous and it's wrong. Because especially as Reformed Christians, we know that sin is deeply embedded in every human being, and therefore it is also deeply embedded in every human institution. So we have to deal with the reality of the problems of racism and things like that that exist within our institutions, but we have to do it right. And again, this is really previews of tomorrow. We have to recognize that there's a real problem there. The problem with conservatives is we, and I would include myself in the category here, we have a tendency to have a backlash against things. So this group says that, we don't like this group, so they are wrong about everything. Not necessarily true. We've got to be much more sophisticated and much more honest in the way we approach the issues.
You mentioned we've forgotten our past. So the agenda of taking down statues, rewriting textbooks, censoring those things, how does that all play into this bigger agenda, the fact that our past isn't being preserved?
George Orwell said that whoever controls the present controls the past, and whoever controls the past controls the future. What is happening is, remember, if you accept a hard definition of systemic racism that says that racism is baked into American society, it cannot really be removed, you cannot really reform it, it's part of it, the only thing you can do is sweep it away and replace it with something else, then getting rid of the past is an important step. So I would say that a lot of, and you'll notice getting rid of the past doesn't only include getting rid of statues of slave owners. It includes getting rid of, it includes defacing the monument to a black regiment that fought in the Civil War. It includes toppling a statue of Frederick Douglass. You have to erase the past if the hard definition of systemic racism is true. We need to get rid of everything about America's past because we need functionally to get rid of American culture completely to replace it with something different. Now, when I said we've forgotten our history, what I meant is the church has forgotten its history. Did you know, for example, that there were 4 separate popes that condemned the Atlantic slave trade during the Renaissance? Right from the time when it started. Did you know that Thomas Aquinas said that slavery violated natural law and therefore was a sin? We get this idea that the southern plantation owners who argued for slavery on the basis of the Bible represented the majority Christian tradition. Actually, they were the aberration. But we don't know that. And we don't really think through what it means to be made in the image of God. There's a whole host of things here that we have the resources to solve the problems. We just don't use them. We've forgotten them.
Do you advocate that we move to a colorblind society?
It all depends on your definition of terms.
What's yours?
Well, let me explain that. The problem with a colorblind society is I would say that race does not exist as an objective reality, but it exists as a social reality. And we live in a world in which race is a serious issue. And to make believe it isn't, to say we can be colorblind right now, is just simply sticking your head in the sand. We can't. Because even though it doesn't have an objective reality, the fact that it has a social reality means we have to deal with it. Colorblind? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we need to recognize the universal and equal dignity of all human beings, regardless of anything about them. We have to advocate for absolutely equal rights, absolutely equal dignity and honor, and all of those kinds of things. However, we do not need to homogenize everything. Different cultures, every culture has got strengths and weaknesses. Every culture has things about it that are positive and things that are negative. Every culture also, on a theological level, I would argue that every culture in its good points refracts part of the image of God in a different way. Therefore, we should celebrate the diversity that exists between cultures, and I will talk about culture rather than race here. I think we need to celebrate and recognize the diversity that exists within cultures, while also recognizing the fact that in a fallen world, all of them have got problems. I'll give you a concrete example. If you were to put me in your average urban African American church, I would have difficulty worshiping there. And it isn't because they're black, it's because their expression of Christianity is different from what I know, different from what I'm used to. I don't necessarily understand it in all respects. It's sufficiently different that I would have a hard time really functioning as a worshiper there. That doesn't mean what they're doing is wrong.
Okay, so if we take race as an idea of phenotype plus culture as kind of a working definition, is systemic racism real or imagined?
Hard or soft definition?
Either one. Both.
Hard definition, yes, it's wrong. Soft definition, yes, it's right. Because racism is a sin, but sin embeds itself in all human cultures and all human institutions. Therefore, there is, well, not necessarily every sin, but given that there is sin in human institutions, I would say there are clear examples where racism is present in our institutions.
Thank you.
So in the soft definition, yes. The hard definition, I would say no. Because if you accept the hard definition, what you are saying is it is impossible for human beings to reform. And I don't believe that. So.
I have a question.
Sure.
It's a two-parter. I was born in 1965, and so by the time in my growing up years, the average or the standard line regarding communism and the Marxists was that yes, we used to think that they were the great enemy, but that was so much silly thinking. We're sort of over that now, and so now. Even to talk about the Marxists are coming for us, it almost has the ring of tinfoil hat wearing kinds of things, even though you can walk back through it step by step and see, you know what, the Marxists are coming for us. So how has that transition gone over the last few decades, and what was the source of this changing company line about who our enemies were and why they were our enemies, et cetera?
Yeah, during the Cold War, it was pretty clear, we were facing the potential of nuclear war and total annihilation and things like that. But as time went on and it became increasingly evident that the Soviet Union, at least, wasn't going to make it, and then when they collapsed, the idea that communism was a real threat largely disappeared. Sort of ignoring China. The problem that comes up, and again, I'm gonna fall back on things like statistics. We think of Hitler as the great mass murderer in history, but Stalin killed 30 million people. Mao did twice that. The greatest mass murderers in history are communists. Everywhere it's been tried, it has utterly failed. So why is it that it's so attractive right now? And the reason is the long march through the institutions. We have the historical event of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which makes it look like the communist threat was really a mirage. But at the same time, you also have, well, let's see, you get the New Left in the 60s and 70s. They're producing PhDs who then go to teach in universities in the 70s. They're producing school teachers and more faculty who are teaching in the 80s, who are producing more school teachers and faculty who are teaching in the 90s, and so on. So you get to the point where in my department, I'm really one of only, well, actually in my entire university, I was one of only 4 conservatives that I knew. Everyone else was varying shades of left. That's how the communist, the dangers of this kind of thinking get downplayed. The New Left won.
So the follow-up question or related question is, what is the common thread between all of these individuals who are trying to work in various ways to make the revolution happen?
Mm.
What are they really want? I mean, what's at the root of it when it seems to be leading into a kind of obvious disintegration of human society? I mean, it seems hard to believe that they really believe a utopia lies on the other side of these things. Do they really believe that, or is this all just a sort of a tool to achieve some other desired end?
2 parts to that. First of all, there are some who genuinely believe in a utopia. Those are the ones who are really scary. Because anybody who believes that they can bring in a utopia is a totalitarian almost by definition.
Right.
Because if you want to bring in a utopia, any dissent threatens the coming golden age, and therefore you must suppress all dissent. Any utopian is going to be a totalitarian. As far as the other goes, the thing that you have to remember is that in critical theory, the one real reality is power. That is the only reality. At the end of the day, it is all about power. So, if we can promote what we are doing, if I can get on the right side of history, note the Hegelian language there, history is going in a direction. If I can get on the right side of history, if I can get myself in a position where I can get power, that's what I want to do. So really, I would argue fundamentally it ends up being a power game. To pick a simple example of this, consider that all the money that the Black Lives Matter movement raised for the George Floyd family, the family is on record as saying not a penny of it reached them. And you have, rather famously, the leader of one of the founders of Black Lives Matter just purchased a month or so ago a multi-million-dollar mansion in an all-white neighborhood in California somewhere. And apparently she owns several others. What's this really about? Is this really about fighting racism, or is it really about me accumulating power, wealth? Now, by the way, just to be fair here, I would say the same thing about people on the right. This is also true on the conservative side. The fact of the matter is we've got a lot of people who are really just simply interested in feathering their own nests or accumulating power or whatever on the other side as well. This is a universal human problem. It is obvious ideologically because of the assumptions that they're doing. They're probably more overt or maybe more direct about it than the right is, but it's still a problem on the right as well, just so that we're clear.
Mm-hmm.
Back around.
Much of my teaching in the university is foundational course for pre-meds and for pre-engineers. You can just imagine very quickly, heavily based on science and math.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Very clearly, that seems to be a casualty. I'm looking at the slide here, white culture. I might as well say that's the definition of my class. Should I expect that such a thing will be taken down? Where is that kind of thing going?
I'm a historian. I'm much better at things that happened in the past than at what's going to happen in the future. At the end of the day, I don't think that that's going to come down. Now, the irony is that you go to the Seattle school system, and they're arguing now in their math classes that they need to use math classes to teach social justice. And among other things, that means that white ideas like there's only one right answer to a math problem, we need to eliminate that. They're literally teaching that. Now, I don't think that's going to go anywhere, because the fact of the matter is the same mathematics that holds a bridge up in America will hold a bridge up in Africa. I don't think that that's going to really, I think that that's an example of ideologues who are, okay, any worldview, and what we're really dealing with here is a worldview, any worldview that stays in power long enough, that becomes dominant for long enough, will always tend to go to its most extreme. The logical, or in many cases illogical, implications of its premises will come out as long as it's in place long enough. What you're seeing in those examples in Seattle is the illogical implications of some of their assumptions being played out in practice. Ultimately, reality bats last. Baseball metaphor, okay? And what that means is that sooner or later, the fact that medicine works, the fact that engineering works, all of these things are going to come back to bite them. And so I don't think in those areas, I don't think that this is really going to have the kind of impact it has in things like the social sciences where I am. I just can't really imagine it happening there.
I'm so much with you, but I have to push back with the whole idea of if the goal is power, does it matter if these things crumble? Does science go toward data-driven, or does it go to a top-down, here's what you should all do, this is science?
Yeah, in the case of hard sciences, I suspect the latter, actually. I think we're already seeing that happening to some extent in a variety of areas. Somehow I don't see it happening in engineering, and not as much in medicine, although medicine has become largely politicized as well. I might be too much of an optimist there, which is something no one in this world has ever accused me of. But, you know, I just really can't imagine it going too far. There's going to be a backlash.
So in fields like engineering and medicine and that kind of thing, there is, as you said, a reality that just is sitting there looking at you that argues against these kinds of things. In the church, however, it's a bit of a different situation. And this leads us a little bit toward what you'll be talking about more tomorrow. But can you set that up a little bit for us in terms of what is the situation that the church is facing with regard to this ideology and the difficulties with sorting through it and being faithful to the Christian faith?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things here. First of all, it's important to recognize that critical theory is a Christian heresy. Think about that. It is a Christian heresy. What do I mean? If you look at cultures around the world historically, the strong always ruled the weak. They always felt themselves perfectly justified in doing this. And if you were a slave or you were oppressed in any way, it's because, frankly, you were too weak and you deserved it. That is changed by Judaism and Christianity. The concern for people who are oppressed is taken from Christianity. Therefore, I would describe it in a very real sense as a Christian heresy. But that also means that that is the entry point for these ideas into the church. We ought to be concerned about the poor. We ought to be concerned about the oppressed. We ought to be concerned about injustice. All of these things are our causes. And when critical theory comes along and starts emphasizing these things, Christian churches recognize it because it's their stuff. And as a result, what happens is critical theory begins with these very legitimate concerns, but then it veers off into a whole bunch of assumptions, which I'll go through tomorrow, a whole bunch of assumptions that are anti-biblical, anti-Christian, and frankly, that violate everything that we know about social science, okay? But nonetheless, because they have this entry point of a legitimate concern about injustice, Christians have a tendency to embrace it. And so this is what will happen in the churches. Now, the place where I think we're going to see the biggest problems are, well, first of all, the issue of racial issues and how to deal with it, and whether or not we can use critical theory as an analytical tool. That's going to be one issue. Where it's going to come, the place that I see the biggest danger right now is in the LGBTQ plus area. If the Equality Act passes, what will happen is, number one, churches will probably be safe for a little while, not for long. What will happen is that non-church Christian institutions are going to lose all federal funding, lose all federal support. They will probably be basically forced to either hire people that their confessional standards say they shouldn't. In other words, they'll have to compromise, or they'll change their confessional standards. The vast majority of churches will take the road that the mainline Protestant denominations took decades ago, and they will conform to the expectations of the culture. The ones that don't, and particularly, like I said, starting with Christian colleges and stuff, are going to be taken to the cleaners. And they will be basically forced out of business. And this is based on the Bob Jones decision. U.S. government versus Bob Jones, I forgot the year. Bob Jones University had a frankly unbiblical policy that forbade interracial dating. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that even though this was a sincerely held religious belief, their words, even though this was a sincerely held religious belief, this violated, I forgot exactly the terminology, but basically federal government policy and standards and such, and therefore they lost their tax-exempt status unless they rescinded the ban. They rescinded the ban. What's going to happen when that becomes LGBT, rather than on the basis of the Equality Act or executive orders, rather than interracial dating? On the basis of that precedent, it's going to remove tax-exempt status, and by the way, once that goes, you can expect accreditation to go too. You lose accreditation, that's the kiss of death. So Christian colleges and universities are right in the crosshairs, and they'll come after the churches shortly thereafter. That's where the danger lies. So you're gonna, basically you'll have a choice between being faithful to your confessional standards in the Bible or continuing to function.
This may be just whetting the appetite a little bit for tomorrow, but I'm curious your thoughts on why, by and large, does the church, and I mean big C and little c, why is the church so eager to jump in and understandably criticize a faulty secular ideology, and yet doesn't want to talk about Christian nationalism, the Capitol insurrection, conspiracy theories like QAnon, and it just makes me wonder, is the church itself afraid of oppression? And if so, why?
I think that there are a couple of reasons here. That is a really important question. And the fact of the matter is the church is a human institution, and as we know, human institutions have sin embedded in them. I think that one of the reasons why there's a reaction against critical race theory, I got into this almost by accident. You know, I'm a Reformation historian. This is all current events. I mean, anything after 1648 is current events. But this, you know, this is not my normal academic bailiwick. I've just spent a lot of time studying it because I keep getting asked about it. I think that the reason why, well, I'm going to have to give you a little more recent U.S. history. Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity, has been deeply embedded in American society like forever. The 1950s, which is often considered by American evangelicals to sort of be a golden age of American Christianity, it was the golden age of sort of Protestant liberal denominations. There was very little in the way of evangelical presence in the 50s.
Would it be a golden age of white Christianity specifically?
Well, yeah, when we talk about mainline Protestantism, it's going to be white, yeah. But I think bringing race into it isn't helpful at this point, but we'll get there. What happens from there is you get Billy Graham, who suddenly starts being on national television. Jimmy Carter, a self-described evangelical, is elected president in 1976. We have a movement headed by Jerry Falwell called the Moral Majority, and all of a sudden evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity comes out of the woodwork, and it suddenly becomes very, very popular. And then what ends up happening is the more evangelical style of Christianity. Once it's popular, it decides it wants to stay popular. And so it attaches itself to all kinds of causes and all kinds of things in an effort to remain popular. This is what's behind ultimately the megachurch phenomenon and things like that. There's a lot I could say about that, but what ends up happening is it gets wedded into a particular set of political ideas that it sees as friendly. And as a result, you get a confusion between what is the gospel and what is politics. Now, some of those causes that they attach themselves to are good causes, but not all of them are. And what ends up happening is the Republican Party in particular uses the abortion issue to guarantee the support of the evangelical community, though you will note that when the Republicans have power, they don't do anything about abortion. Basically, they've been using the evangelicals, okay? But what ends up happening is the evangelicals get wedded to the Republicans and therefore sort of blindly support anything a Republican or conservative candidate says because they're our people, quote unquote, which means that they've adopted their own set of blinders. And they're wrong.
Thank you for your answers. Will you be talking tomorrow about a response?
Yeah.
A criticism of CRT is warranted. Will there be a response to it so we have something to offer instead of just a criticism?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah. I'm going to be talking about strategies and ideas that I think we need to follow as we're moving forward. I'm not going to lay out a specific program, do the following, but I am going to be talking about that. And again, part of that is recognizing where they're right. It's recognizing the problems that genuinely do exist, but I think there are better solutions.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Glenn, for session number 1. It's been very enlightening. Yeah, as was just said, tomorrow night's going to be a little bit of a shift toward a little bit more assessment, but then a transition to, and so then what? How do we engage this and stay faithful to the Lord and to the mission of the church? So let's close in prayer. Lord God, as your church has done or has experienced so often before, we face today serious challenges from every angle to the faith, to truth. And we pray that you would help not only give us understanding, give us open eyes and minds and hearts, but fill us, Lord, with your answers, that we might embrace your truth wherever it is, wherever it stands, that we might be your people and serve your purposes in the days in which we live. We pray that you would go with us now as we go our homeward way, and we pray that you would bring us back again tomorrow night and bless our time together then as well. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you very much.